Chapter 11 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 11, Fort Donelson. The news of the fall of Fort Henry created a sudden consternation among the Confederate commanders in Tennessee. It seemed as if the keystone had unexpectedly fallen out of their arch of well-planned defenses. Generals A.S. Johnston, Beauregard, and Hardee immediately met in a council of war at Bowling Green, and after full discussion united in a memorandum acknowledging the disaster and resolving on the measures which in their judgment it rendered necessary. They foresaw that Fort Donelson would probably also fall, that Johnston's army must retreat to Nashville to avoid capture, that since Columbus was now separated from Bowling Green, the main army at Columbus must fall back to Humboldt or possibly to Grand Junction, leaving only a sufficient garrison to make a desperate defense of the works and the river, and immediate orders were issued to prepare for these movements. Nevertheless, Johnston, to use his own language, resolved, "to fight for Nashville at Donelson." For this purpose he divided the army at Bowling Green, starting 8,000 of his men under Generals Buckner and Floyd, together with 4,000 more under Pillow from other points, on a rapid march to reinforce the threatened fort, while General Hardee led his remaining 14,000 men on their retreat to Nashville. This retreat was not alone a choice of evils. Even if Fort Henry had not fallen, and Donelson been so seriously menaced, the overwhelming force of Buell would have compelled a retrograde movement. Had Buell been a commander of more enterprise, he would have seized this chance of inflicting great damage upon the diminished enemy in retreat. His advance guard, indeed, followed, but Johnston's remnant, marching night and day, succeeded in reaching the Cumberland River opposite Nashville, where, after preparations to cross in haste, the rebel commander waited with intense eagerness to hear the fate of Donelson. Of the two commanders in the West, the idea of the movement up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers was more favorably thought of by Halleck than by Buell. Buell pointed out its value, but began no movement that looked to its execution. Halleck, on the contrary, not only realized its importance, but immediately entertained the design of ultimately carrying it out. Thus he wrote at the time he ordered the reconnaissance which demonstrated its practicability, "The demonstration which General Grant is now making, I have no doubt will keep them (the enemy) in check till preparations can be made for operations on the Tennessee or Cumberland." His conception of the necessary preparations was, however, almost equivalent to the rejection of the plan. He thought that it would require a force of 60,000 men, and to delay it till that number and the requisite material of war could be gathered or detached, under prevailing ideas, would amount to indefinite postponement. When at last, through Grant's importunity, the movement was actually begun by the advance to capture Fort Henry, a curious interest in the expedition and its capabilities developed itself among the commanders. Grant's original proposition was simply to capture Fort Henry and establish a large camp. Nothing further was proposed, and Halleck's instructions went only to the same extent, with one addition. As the reported approach of Beauregard with reinforcements had been the turning influence in Halleck's consent, so he proposed that the capture of Fort Henry should be immediately followed by a dash at the railroad bridges across the Tennessee and their destruction, to prevent those reinforcements from reaching Johnston. But with the progress of Grant's movement, the chances of success brightened, and the plan began correspondingly to expand. On the 2nd of February, when Grant's troops were preparing to invest Fort Henry, Halleck's estimate of coming possibilities had risen a little. He wrote to Buell, "At present it is only proposed to take and occupy Fort Henry and Dover (Donelson), and, if possible, cut the railroad from Columbus to Bowling Green." Here we have Donelson added to Henry in the intention of the department commander. That the same intention existed in Grant's mind is evident, for, as already related, on the fall of Henry on the 6th, he immediately telegraphed to Halleck, "Fort Henry is ours. I shall take and destroy Fort Donelson on the 8th, and return to Fort Henry." It is to be noted that, in proposing to destroy Fort Donelson, he still limits himself to his original proposition of an entrenched camp at Fort Henry. At the critical moment, Halleck's confidence in success at Fort Henry wavered, and he called upon Buell with importunity for sufficient help to make sure work of it. But Buell, commanding 72,502 men, 46,150 of them fit for the field, could only send a single brigade to aid in a work which he had described as of such momentous consequence. Afterwards, indeed, he sent 8 regiments more, but these were raw troops from Ohio and Indiana, which McClellan, with a curious misconception of their usefulness, had ordered to Buell, who did not need them, instead of to Halleck, who was trying to make every man do double duty. McClellan, satisfied that Buell could not advance against Johnston's force at Bowling Green over the difficult winter roads, and having not yet heard of the surrender of Fort Henry, suggested to both Buell and Halleck the temporary suspension of operations on other lines in order to make a quick combined movement up the Tennessee and the Cumberland. This was on February 6th. Buell's fancy at first caught at the proposal, for he replied that evening, "This whole move, right in its strategical bearing, but commenced by General Halleck without appreciation, preparation, or concert, has now become of vast magnitude. I was myself thinking of a change of the line to support it when I received your dispatch. It will have to be made in the face of 50,000, if not 60,000 men, and is hazardous. I will answer definitely in the morning." Halleck was more positive in his convictions. He telegraphed to McClellan on the same day, "If you can give me, in addition to what I have in this department, 10,000 men, I will take Fort Henry, cut the enemy's line, and paralyze Columbus. Give me 25,000, and I will threaten Nashville, and cut off railroad communications so as to force the enemy to abandon Bowling Green without a battle." News of the fall of Fort Henry having been received at Washington, McClellan 24 hours later telegraphed to Halleck, "Either Buell or yourself should soon go to the scene of operations. Why not have Buell take the line of the Tennessee and operate on Nashville while your troops turn Columbus? These 2 points gained, a combined movement on Memphis will be next in order." The dispatch was in substance repeated to Buell, who by this time thought he had made up his mind, for 2 hours later he answered, "I cannot on reflection think that a change of my line would be advisable. I hope General Grant will not require further reinforcements. I will go if necessary." Thus, on the night of the 7th, with the sole aid from himself of the single drilled brigade from Green River and the 8 raw regiments from Ohio and Indiana, he proposed to leave the important central line on which Grant had started to its chances. A night's reflection made him doubt the correctness of his decision, for he telegraphed on the morning of the 8th, "I am concentrating and preparing, but will not decide definitely yet." Halleck's views were less changeable. At noon on the 8th he again urged that Buell should transfer the bulk of his forces to the Cumberland River to move by water on Nashville. To secure this cooperation, he further proposed a modification of department lines to give Buell command on the Cumberland and Hitchcock or Sherman on the Tennessee, with superior command for himself over both. No immediate response came from Washington, and 3 days elapsed when Halleck asked Buell specifically, "Can't you come with all your available forces and command the column up the Cumberland? I shall go to the Tennessee this week." Buell's desire, vibrating like a pendulum between the 2 brilliant opportunities before him, now swung toward Halleck's proposal, but with indefiniteness and fatal slowness. He answered that he would go either to the Cumberland or to the Tennessee, but that it would require 10 days to transfer his troops. During his hesitation, events forced him to a new conclusion. News came that the rebels had evacuated Bowling Green, and he telegraphed, "The evacuation of Bowling Green, leaving the way open to Nashville, makes it proper to resume my original plan. I shall advance on Nashville with all the speed I can." From this last determination Halleck appealed beseechingly to the general in chief. He announced that Grant had formally invested Fort Donelson, and that the bombardment was progressing favorably, but he further explained that since the evacuation of Bowling Green the enemy were concentrating against Grant. He claimed that it was bad strategy for Buell to advance on Nashville over broken bridges and bad roads, and this point he reiterated with emphasis. He telegraphed on February 16th, I am still decidedly of the opinion that Buell should not advance on Nashville, but come to the Cumberland with his available forces. United to Grant, we can take and hold Fort Donelson and Clarksville, and by another central movement cut off both Columbus and Nashville. Unless we can take Fort Donelson very soon, we shall have the whole force of the enemy on us. Fort Donelson is the turning point of the war, and we must take it at whatever sacrifice." But his appeal was unavailing. McClellan took sides with Buell, insisting that to occupy Nashville would be most decisive. Buell had indeed ordered Nelson's division to go to the help of Grant, but in the conflict of his own doubts and intentions the orders had been so tardy that Nelson's embarkation was only beginning on the day when Donelson surrendered. McClellan's further conditional order to Buell, to help Grant if it were necessary, offered a yet more distant prospect of succor. If the siege of Donelson had been prolonged, assistance from these directions would, of course, have been found useful. In the actual state of facts, however, they show both Buell and McClellan incapable, even under continued pressure, of seizing and utilizing the fleeting chances of war which so often turn the scale of success, and which so distinctly call out to the higher qualities of military leadership. Amidst the sluggish counsels of commanders of departments, the energy of Grant and the courage and intrepidity of his raw Western soldiers had already decided one of the great crises of the war. Grant had announced to Halleck that he would storm Fort Donelson on the 8th of February, but he failed to count one of the chances of delay. "I contemplated taking Fort Donelson to day with infantry and cavalry alone," reported he, "but all my troops may be kept busily engaged in saving what we now have from the rapidly rising waters." This detention served to change the whole character of the undertaking. If he could have marched and attacked on the 8th, he would have found but 6,000 men in the fort, which his own troops largely outnumbered. As it turned out, the half of Johnston's army sent from Bowling Green and other points, conducted by Generals Pillow, Floyd, and Buckner, arrived before the fort was invested, increasing the garrison to an aggregate of 17,000, and greatly extending the line of rifle pits and other defenses. General Grant's estimate of the Confederate forces is 21,000. He says he marched against the fort with but 15,000, but that he received reinforcements before the attack, and their arrival had, at the time of the surrender, increased his army to about 27,000. Grant, Personal Memoirs, Vol. 1, pages 299, 305, 315. This presented an altogether different and more serious problem. The enemy before Grant was now, if not superior, at least equal in numbers, and had besides the protection of a large and well constructed earthwork, armed with 17 heavy and 48 field guns. It is probable that this changed aspect of affairs was not immediately known to him. If it was, he depended on the reinforcements which Halleck promised, and which soon began to arrive. Early on the morning of the 12th he started on his march, with the divisions of McClernand and of Brigadier General C. F. Smith, numbering 15,000. At noon they were within 2 miles of Donelson. That afternoon and all the following day, February 13th, were occupied in driving in the rebel pickets, finding the approaches, and drawing the lines of investment around the fort. A gallant storming assault by 4 Illinois regiments upon one of the rebel batteries was an exciting incident of the afternoon's advance, but was unsuccessful. To understand the full merit of the final achievement, the conditions under which the siege of Donelson was thus begun must be briefly mentioned. The principal fort, or earthwork which bore the military name, lay on the west bank of the Cumberland River, half a mile north of the little town of Dover. The fort occupied the terminal knoll of a high ridge ending in the angle between the river and the mouth of Hickman Creek. This main work consisted of 2 batteries of heavy guns, primarily designed to control the river navigation. But when General Johnson resolved to defend Nashville at Donelson, and gathered an army of 17,000 men for the purpose, the original fort and the town of Dover, and all the intervening space, were enclosed by a long, irregular line of rifle pits, connecting more substantial breastworks and embankments on the favorable elevations, in which field batteries were planted. The whole chain of entrenchments, extending from Hickman Creek on the north till it enclosed the town of Dover on the south, having a total length of about 2½ miles. Outside the rifle pits were the usual obstructions of felled trees and abatis, forming an interlacing barrier, difficult to penetrate. The Union troops had had no fighting at Fort Henry. At that place the gunboats had done the work. The debarkation on the Tennessee, the reconnaissance, the march towards Donelson, the picket skirmishing during the 12th and 13th, had only been such as to give them zest and exhilaration. When, on the morning of the 12th, the march began, the weather was mild and agreeable, but on the afternoon of the 13th, while the army was stretching itself cautiously around the rebel intrenchments, the thermometer suddenly went down. A winter storm set in, with rain, snow, sleet, ice, and a piercing northwest wind, that made the men lament the imprudence they had committed in leaving overcoats and blankets behind. Grant's army was composed entirely of Western regiments, 15 from the single State of Illinois, and a further aggregate of 17 from the States of Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, and Iowa. Some of these regiments had seen guerrilla fighting in Missouri, some had been through the Battle of Belmont, but many were new to the privations and dangers of an active campaign. Nearly all the officers came from civil life, but a common thought, energy, and will animated the whole mass. It was neither discipline nor mere military ambition. It was patriot work in its noblest and purest form. They had left their homes and varied, peaceful occupations to defend the government and put down the rebellion. They were in the flush and exaltation of a common heroic impulse. In such a mood, the rawest recruit was as brave as the oldest veteran, and in this spirit they endured hunger and cold, faced snow and ice, held tenaciously the lines of the siege, climbed without flinching through the tangled abattis, and advanced into the deadly fire from the rifle pits with a purpose and a devotion never excelled by soldiers of any nation or epoch. Flag Officer Foote with 6 gunboats arrived on the evening of the 13th, also 6 regiments sent by water. Fort Henry had been reduced by the gunboats alone, and it was resolved first to try the effect of these new and powerful fighting machines upon the works of Donelson. Accordingly, on Friday, February 14th, the assault was begun by an attack from the 6 gunboats. As before, the situation of the fort enabled the 4 ironclads to advance upstream towards the batteries, the engines holding them steadily against the swift current, presenting their heavily plated bows as a target for the enemy. The attack had lasted for an hour and a half. The ironclads were within 400 yards of the rebel embankments, the heavy armor was successfully resisting the shot and shell from the fort, the fire of the enemy was slackening, indicating that the water batteries were becoming untenable, when 2 of the gunboats were suddenly disabled and drifted out of the fight, one having her wheel carried away, and the other her tiller ropes damaged. These accidents, due to the weakness and exposure of the pilot houses, compelled a cessation of the river attack and a withdrawal of the gunboats for repairs, and gave the beleaguered garrison corresponding exultation and confidence. Flag Officer Foote had been wounded in the attack, and deeming it necessary to take his disabled vessels temporarily back to Cairo, he requested Grant to visit him for consultation. Grant therefore went on board one of the gunboats before dawn on the morning of the 15th, and it was arranged between the commanders that he should perfect his lines and hold the fort in siege until Foote could return from Cairo to assist in renewing the attack. During all this time there had been a fluctuation of fear and hope in the garrison, from the repulse of McClernand's assault on the 13th, the prompt investment of the fort, the gunboat attack, and its repulse. There was want of harmony between Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner, the 3 commanders within the fort. Prior to the gunboat attack, a bold sortie was resolved upon, which project was, however, abandoned through the orders or non-compliance of Pillow. That night the Second Council of War determined to make a serious effort to extricate the garrison. At 6 o'clock on the morning of the 15th, the divisions of Pillow and Buckner moved out to attack McClernand's division, and, if possible, open an avenue of retreat by the road running southward from Dover to Charlotte. The Confederates made their attack, not only with spirit, but with superior numbers. Driving back McClernand's right, they were, by 11 o'clock in the forenoon, in complete possession of the Charlotte road. Buckner, who simultaneously attacked McClernand's left, did not fare so well. He was repulsed and compelled to retire to the intrenchments from which he had issued. At this critical point Grant returned from his visit to Foote. What he found and what he did is stated with brevity in the message he hastily sent back. If all the gunboats that can will immediately make their appearance to the enemy, it may secure us a victory. Otherwise all may be defeated. A terrible conflict ensued in my absence, which has demoralized a portion of my command, and I think the enemy is much more so. If the gunboats do not show themselves, it will reassure the enemy and still further demoralize our troops. I must order a charge to save appearances. I do not expect the gunboats to go into action, but to make appearance and throw a few shells at a long range." In execution of the design here announced, Grant sent an order to General C. F. Smith, commanding the Second Division, who held the extreme left of the investing line, to storm the intrenchments in front of him. His men had as yet had no severe fighting, and now went forward enthusiastically, carrying an important outwork with impetuous gallantry. Learning of his success, Grant in turn ordered forward the entire remainder of his force, under Brigadier General Lew Wallace and General McClernand. This order was executed during the forenoon, and by nightfall the whole of the ground lost by the enemy's morning attack was fully regained. There is a conflict of testimony about the object of the attack of the enemy. Buckner says it was to effect the immediate escape of the garrison. Pillow says he had no such understanding, and that neither he nor anyone else made preparation for departure. The opportunity, therefore, which his division had during the forenoon to retire by the open road to Charlotte was not improved. By evening the chance was gone, for the Federals had once more closed that avenue of escape. During the night of the 15th, the Confederate commanders met in council to decide what they should do. Buckner, the junior, very emphatically gave the others to understand that the situation of the garrison was desperate, and that it would require but an hour or two of assault on the next morning to capture his portion of the defenses. Such a contingency left them no practical alternative. Floyd and Pillow had exaggerated ideas of the personal danger they would be in from the Government if they permitted themselves to become prisoners, and made known their great solicitude to get away. An agreement was therefore reached, through which Floyd, the senior general, first turned over his command to Pillow, then Pillow, the second in command, in the same way relinquished his authority to Buckner, the junior general. This formality completed, Pillow hastily crossed the river and went to Clarksville with his staff, while Floyd, taking advantage of the arrival of a rebel steamer, boarded it with his personal followers during the night, and abandoned the fort and its garrison. As usual, the active correspondents of Western newspapers were with the expedition, and through their telegrams something of the varying fortunes of the Kentucky campaign and the Donelson siege had become known to the country, while President Lincoln at Washington gleaned still further details from the scattering official reports which came to the War Department through army channels. The new events again aroused his most intense solicitude, and prompted him to send the following suggestion by telegraph to Halleck. "You have Fort Donelson safe, unless Grant shall be overwhelmed from outside, to prevent which latter will, I think, require all the vigilance, energy, and skill of yourself and Buell acting in full cooperation. Columbus will not get at Grant, but the force from Bowling Green will. They hold the railroad from Bowling Green to within a few miles of Fort Donelson, with the bridge at Clarksville undisturbed. It is unsafe to rely that they will not dare expose Nashville to Buell. A small part of their force can retire slowly towards Nashville, breaking up the railroad as they go, and keep Buell out of that city 20 days. Meantime, Nashville will be abundantly defended by forces from all south, and perhaps from here at Manassas. Could not a cavalry force from General Thomas on the upper Cumberland dash across, almost unresisted, and cut the railroad at or near Knoxville, Tennessee? In the midst of a bombardment at Fort Donelson, why could not a gunboat run up and destroy the bridge at Clarksville? Our success or failure at Fort Donelson is vastly important, and I beg you to put your soul in the effort. I send a copy of this to Buell." Before this telegram reached its destination, the siege of Donelson was terminated. On Sunday morning, the 16th of February, when the troops composing the Federal line of investment were preparing for a final assault, a note came from Buckner to Grant, proposing an armistice to arrange terms of capitulation. The language of Grant's reply served to crown the fame of his achievement. "Yours of this date, proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation, is just received. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." His resolute phrase gained him a prouder title than was ever bestowed by knightly accolade. Thereafter the army and the country, with a fanciful play upon the initials of his name, spoke of him as Unconditional Surrender Grant. Buckner had no other balm for the sting of his defeat than to say that Grant's terms were ungenerous and unchivalric, but that necessity compelled him to accept them. That day Grant was enabled to telegraph to Halleck, "We have taken Fort Donelson, and from 12,000 to 15,000 prisoners, including Generals Buckner and Bushrod R. Johnson, also about 20,000 stands of arms, 48 pieces of artillery, 17 heavy guns, from 2,000 to 4,000 horses, and large quantities of commissary stores." By this brilliant and important victory, Grant's fame sprang suddenly into full and universal recognition. President Lincoln nominated him Major General of Volunteers, and the Senate at once confirmed the appointment. The whole military service felt the inspiriting event. Many of the colonels in Grant's army were made brigadier generals, and promotion ran like a quickening leaven through the whole organization. Halleck also reminded the Government of his desire for larger power. "Make Buell, Grant, and Pope major generals of volunteers," he telegraphed the day after the surrender, "and give me command in the West. I ask this in return for Forts Henry and Donelson." End of chapter 11. Recording by Owen Cook in Potawatomi ceded land.